Hi, Aaron.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Not bad. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and audio podcast. A phenomenon that I think is familiar to you, as we will explore, because your stuff is available that way too. And you are Aaron Maté, and I'm really eager to talk to you because I've done a few conversations where I'm kind of trying to explore the kind of rapidly evolving ideological landscape in America. I mean, evolving largely in response to Donald Trump, or at least maybe he is himself just a manifestation of the increasingly rapid evolution. But I'm also interested in the evolving media landscape, and you represent an intersection of the two because you're a producer and host at The Real News, which is I'll let you describe it, but it's a video thing that, unlike Blogging Heads, is more. It's produced, more like an actual kind of news show in some respects, and it also does have the audio podcast manifestation. And I guess before we talk more about The Real News, let me just ask you where you see yourself. The Real News. They may not be exactly the same thing, but I think there is a kind of ideological character to The Real News, right? Where you see yourself fitting on the landscape, how you would label yourself or selves.
Yeah. Well, me personally, I mean, I'm definitely on the left. I always have been since I was, intellectually aware. In terms of where I see myself in journalism, to me, one of the most noble aspects of being a journalist is being someone who holds power accountable. And no matter whether that's, private power here in the U.S. or government power anywhere around the world. But because I'm here in the U.S., my primary concern is the U.S. government and holding elite institutions here to account. And so that's just, that's kind of what attracted me to journalism in the first place. Aside from I just like telling stories and exploring topics, it's intellectually interesting to me. Mm-hmm. But in terms of my political affiliation, it's never been a question that I'm just someone on the left. I grew up in a sort of a Jewish socialist background. Went to Jewish socialist summer camp. It was always just a part of my life, and so it's just become the leftist aspect for me is just kind of second nature.
Yeah. Okay. And The Real News itself is, broadly speaking, more or less on the left?
The Real News is definitely considered to be on the left. It starts from I can't speak for it because I didn't found it. I mean, I've been working there for a year. But my sense of it is that, it starts from a place that, for journalism to be practiced in its most unencumbered, truest form, the truest to the mission of telling stories honestly, it has to be freed from institutional control by institutions, especially that have, a serious political motive and that that are tied to powerful elements of society that journalism should be holding to account. Mm-hmm. So that's why The Real News is it's viewer supported. It relies on donations, but doesn't take government or corporate money, because the thinking there is that the moment you take money and resources from governments or big private capital in the form of advertisement, you're potentially compromising your journalism. And now it's a tough model to pull off, and I don't think it's at this point in time in our bleak media landscape, it's not something that everyone can do. But to the extent that it's possible, I think it's very noble. And it does lead to a certain kind of institutional freedom on key political issues that I don't think you'll find in the corporate news structure.
Yeah, I do think that complete support by viewers or whatever, by users, it's not complete liberation. Because you do find you do need to attract the audience, so to some extent you're in the ratings game. But totally. I think it's the closest thing to liberation of all the models, as long as you work hard to stay true to whatever your mission is. So now is it a mistake to think of you, and this is just based on, we should say I had one conversation with you. You generously had me on your show for my book, my book on Buddhism, to talk about that. And then I see you on Twitter and stuff. Is it wrong to think of you as in the like Glenn Greenwald left?
No, I mean, insofar as that's a term, no, it's not wrong, because I mean, I love Glenn. He's one of my favorite writers, and especially on the issue of Russiagate, which he's been very prolific on over the past year. I mean, I really value what he says, which is based on the simple premise that we shouldn't just blindly accept government claims or intelligence community claims. We should see evidence, and that's sort of been his starting point. And I think it's very laudable, and I certainly agree with it. And so, especially on the issue of Russiagate, I very much like what he's been saying, and I've been trying to, advance my own arguments along those lines. That, well, first of all, again, that we don't just blindly accept intelligence community claims on faith, and also we look at the potential political utility of Russiagate for powerful forces in this country, and we apply healthy skepticism to them, and that's certainly what I've been doing. I think Russiagate is especially for the topic we want to get to today, which is the political media landscape. I think Russiagate has been extremely dangerous, and especially dangerous for the left, for reasons that I can get into.
Yeah. Why don't you start by elaborating on what you mean by? I think you said that powerful forces or something could make use of Russiagate in malign ways. What are you concerned about?
Well, to look. Starting with the evidence so far in Russiagate, I actually think that the evidentiary basis for this notion that there was coordination, a conspiracy, collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, I've seen no evidence for that so far. And I've also seen no evidence even for the claim that's now taken as like an uncontested truth in media and in political culture that the Russian government ordered this sprawling campaign to interfere in U.S. democracy and elect Donald Trump. I actually don't see the evidence for that. I think it's obvious that some Russian actors were involved in some kind of funny business in the U.S. But in terms of this like concerted Russian government effort to elect Trump through hacking emails and cyber warfare, I mean, there's the claims of that by the U.S. intelligence community. But I'm still a year later waiting for evidence.
But do you suspect that some ideological group or institutional group is, I don't mean necessarily in a conspiratorial way, but is seeing its agenda advanced through Russiagate, and in that sense has a kind of not entirely disclosed interest in the thing or something?
Yes, exactly. I don't think there's a conspiracy, but I think there is a convergence of utility for many different sectors of privilege and power who are in the position to benefit from this whole thing, and that speaks to its persistence. So, to me, it starts with, it actually starts on the campaign trail when you had leaks coming out about Trump and about this alleged Russian effort to elect him. It started even before the election, and I can't prove this, but I suspect that people in the intelligence community, like John Brennan, who was who was the head of the CIA at the time, who was a pretty obvious that he supported Hillary. He was among the intelligence officials, both in and out of government, who were concerned about Donald Trump, because on the campaign trail, Trump was portraying himself. It turned out to be a total con, of course, but he was portraying himself as being anti-intervention.
Right.
He talked about he was criticizing Hillary in Libya. He was talking about the Iraq War being a mistake.
No, so he was a neocon's worst nightmare. Although now, if you look at who he's actually appointing, it's like neocon central. I mean, with these last two appointments at State and NSA.
Exactly. Rhetorically, he was a neocon nightmare, but actually now in power, he's a neocon dream. And that speaks to, again, we can get to this later maybe, but why I think Russiagate is so dangerous. Because in this bid to prove this whole thing about Putin controlling Trump and them being in cahoots, we're missing the fact of what is going on before our eyes, which includes Trump basically appointing all the people or Trump catering to the interests of all those who opposed him on the campaign trail and portrayed him as and bought into this con that he pulled on us as being sort of anti-intervention and anti-U.S. militarism.
Yeah.
So I think it starts there, and we know from really good reporting especially in the book Shattered, which is by two Capitol Hill reporters. It's like the inside definitive account of the Clinton campaign. It's based on interviews with dozens of former staffers. And they tell a story that basically within 24 hours of Clinton losing, the staff decided that something was not kosher here, and there had to be sort of some alternative explanation for Clinton's loss. And they came up with immediately Comey, because Comey came out a few days before the election and reopened the Clinton email server investigation. And they came up with Russia, and they worked very hard to spin this narrative. So far we have intelligence community people uncomfortable with Trump and his rhetoric on the campaign trail. Now we have the Democrats seeking for a way to, I think, understandably deflect blame for their loss to one of the worst candidates in history. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're talking about Donald Trump here. And then finally, you have that converging with a very entrenched Washington consensus that this is going on for decades, which ratchets up tensions with Russia for domestic purposes. Mostly, it helps justify high military expenditures, and in general sees Russia as a threat. I mean, in part for legitimate reasons, because obviously Russia is our nuclear rival, so Russia is a threat. But also Russia has, is also just a powerful country, and powerful countries. I mean, if you accept the premise that the U.S. is a hegemonic power, then any other hegemonic country or any other rival hegemon, even one small, is going to be some sort of a threat in some ways. And certainly Russia has asserted itself in Syria. It's gotten involved there. And you have this whole giant this NATO system, which is enlarging and encroaching on Russia, and Russia has pushed back, and that's caused a lot of tension. So I see a convergence there of mainly these three powerful interests, plus a media culture that thrives on clicks and ratings. So this is like a really kind of exciting thing. It's like a real life spy thriller. It involves intrigue and conspiracy. And it's also a way, I think, in the same way that Watergate was a way for the media to performatively oppose the guy in power, Nixon. It's a way for them to, put on a show of challenging power, but really actually still serving the interests of the corporate sector that more or less, it's a way for them to oppose power without actually really challenging the real powerful forces in this country. Mm-hmm. So, you can appear adversarial by taking on Trump over Russia. But if you're not taking him on over, say, this massive tax bill, which was just a huge giveaway to the rich, you're not taking him on really over his military strategy and killing civilians in Yemen, then you're actually entrenching the established consensus, and you're appearing to oppose power. But really, all you're doing is doing the bidding of the one faction of the elite that doesn't like Trump. In the same way that Watergate was a way for the media to take on Nixon while still serving the interests of Democrats, and not taking on Nixon over, say, Vietnam or Cambodia or COINTELPRO. Actual real threats to the country, I think, that are bigger than breaking into a hotel room, or in this case, possibly releasing some hacked emails.
Okay, so there's a couple of places where we could go. I think I maybe want to talk a little about the phrase the deep state, but first let me preface it by a couple of things. First of all, on this show, I not infrequently talk about the psychology of tribalism, and it is an interesting phenomenon the way sometimes rather than define our tribal affiliation in terms of our ideology, we actually arrange our ideology to comport with our pre-existing tribal affiliation. And a good example of that is people on the left who are suddenly cold warriors almost. I mean, they want us to get tougher on Russia, and it's almost not always explicit exhortation, but it's the effect of saying suspiciously, look how soft Trump is on Russia, to put pressure on him to get harder on Russia. And that's actually a reversal of the traditional ideological polarity in this country.
Of course.
And meanwhile, you've got people on the right going, Russia threat? What Russia threat? Because and so it's just a weird thing. I just wanted to get that out there. The other thing is just to say, as far as where I stand, let me just preface the next kind of question with this. I, to some extent, absolutely share your view. I think the Russia thing, it has the effect of steering us toward more of a Cold War policy than may be optimal at this moment, when actually there are some problems like Syria that maybe you could come closer to solving with some Russian cooperation. And also, it's just a distraction. It's like you said, it's like on Yemen. Did anyone notice that last week there was a vote in the Senate that would have that didn't fail by a super large margin, that would have basically ended our involvement, our support of Saudi Arabia's ongoing bombing of Yemen? It got virtually no airtime because we're all so busy, with Trump and Russiagate and stuff. So that's my feeling. I think where I'm a little different from you is I am more. Well, I guess you describe yourself as agnostic on Russiagate. But it would certainly not surprise me at all if there's a there. I of some form. I mean, I think I'm less skeptical of you than you of the possibility that. I mean, I don't think Russia at the very beginning of the Trump campaign said he's our guy, let's do it. But I think as his nomination became likely, they started. Well, some Russia actors started playing footsie in ways that could have well evolved into something clearly untoward. It could have certainly led to a situation where people in the Trump administration, in the Trump campaign, including Trump, were aware of illegal things Russia did, which is a crime as I understand it. I know you had Marcy Wheeler on your show, and she kind of tried to talk you into being a little more suspicious, and we've had her on our show. But so anyway, my degree of agnosticism may be different from yours, but I definitely share the concern about Russiagate, and with all that said, I want to ask a question about the deep state. But first, you want to reply to that by way of clarifying your position or anything, or?
Yeah, I mean, we do know that Democratic Party emails and John Podesta's emails were taken from them without their permission.
Right.
So there's, I'm not sure if, like, in the case of Podesta, I mean, someone spearphished him where literally, like the story is that he received an email saying, your password's been compromised, change it here. And he asked the staffer, should I do this? And the staffer said yes. I think the staffer later said he meant to say no. So there was a miscommunication there. So, but,
that was like, you had one job, man.
Yeah.
That was like the most amazing alibi I've ever seen. Your job, you are the security person.
Yeah.
They ask you, should I click on this?
Yeah.
And you're saying it was a typo that you said yes instead of no. Anyway, I digress. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's something like definitely or definitely. Anyway, it's like, so Podesta, I'm not even sure what category of criminal law the Podesta case falls under, because it was like such a basic, and it was a voluntary it was like he was a willing participant even in he was a participant.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it's still illegal to steal his emails, right?
It is illegal. I'm sure it is.
So technically, if Trump knew about that,
yeah, sure.
That's I think the term is actually is it conspiracy? I think it's or there's a term. It's illegal to know about illegal behavior and not report it, right?
Totally. And I just don't see any reason. I don't see why they even would know of it. And I think, if they were told of it, I think also we would know by now, because the NSA, like, we know that they tracked other phone calls between Flynn and the Russian ambassador. They also had a surveillance warrant of Carter Page. So I think it's quite likely if there was some sort of shady communication between Trump people and the Russian government, I think we'd know about it by now. Or certainly, maybe the investigators already have it and we're going to find out.
Yeah, it could be there. I mean, I don't think Mueller himself is trying to leak much. I think the leaks, this will lead us to the deep state, because I think the leaks have, a lot of them have come from the intelligence agencies. But I would say that June meeting in Trump Tower, There's not a record of what happened. We have some notes from Manafort, but nobody who is there has flipped. They're trying to get Manafort to flip, but nobody is telling them what happened at that meeting. And there is reason to believe that a couple of people at the meeting, whom Trump had met before he knew, were then ushered up to Trump's office. So if that happened, we would not know about what was said. And that's where Trump could well have heard something about something illegal.
That's possible. I personally, if I were to make a bet, I don't think that's what happened. I actually, like for me, the official story is quite plausible that this Russian lawyer was trying to lobby against these Magnitsky Act sanctions on the Russian government, and she tried to sway the Trump people. They weren't interested. Even in the email that Rob Goldstone, the music publicist, sent to set up the meeting, he said that the compromising information on Hillary that they were offering to Trump was about her dealings with the Russian government. Right. That literally was the selling point. Hillary Clinton's dealings with the Russian government, which of course had nothing to do with the WikiLeaks emails that came out later on. That there was nothing there on Hillary's ties to Russia.
Now there's a separate. I mean, we shouldn't get into this too deeply, but there's a separate possible chain of knowledge involving Papadopoulos, right? Who because he told this Australian diplomat or something about like there's actual emails or something. So there's that. I don't know, but anyway, I'm just kind of clarifying.
There's smoke. There definitely
my stance, and in a way, I wonder whether, almost as a tactical matter, people of your kind of persuasion would be well advised to not overdo the skepticism, because then if it turns out there's something there, the way these things work is you guys were wrong. Yeah. Why should we listen to you again? Of course, that's not always effective. Like people who supported the Iraq War, we're still listening to them, so that doesn't always work. Yeah. But anyway, as as your public relations consultant, that might.
I appreciate it, Bob. Thank you.
No problem.
I'll take it under advisement.
No problem. So now this deep state thing. I first heard the term deep state, I think when I was actually in Turkey, but I heard it in the context of Turkey. This was years ago before it became like a term in America. And there the idea was, look, there's a well-defined body of people in Turkey who actually control things. They get together and they have meetings, and when the democratically elected government has gone too far, they say, okay, it's time for a coup. And that was actually the way it worked for a while. It doesn't anymore, but that was a very well-defined deep state. It involved intelligence agencies and military people, and they were just running the country behind the scenes. Now, I think nobody thinks that's what's going on now, and I don't even know how you feel about the term deep state, but I do think there is such a thing as the establishment in some, somewhat amorphous sense. And I do think that when the Trump presidency hit everybody's radar screen as a serious possibility, that is, once he had the nomination, a lot of people in the establishment freaked out, and some of them, I'm sure, for reasons I would applaud. I mean, he's a scary guy. He does not respect. He doesn't respect democracy truly. He doesn't respect our values. I never bought the idea that he was going to be the next Gandhi on foreign policy, so I wasn't pacified by that. And I'm ambivalent. I mean, I do think one thing that's characteristic of what I just called the Glenn Greenwald left, and is in a way is admirable, is a very strict position on like intelligence agencies leaking things to serve their agendas. It's just, I think across the board, Glenn and people are just consistent. And I really admire that. But when I think, well, maybe, they leak, if I was sitting in the CIA and thought I could leak something that would keep him from being president, I'd be pretty damn tempted. I'm not, so anyway, my view is, I guess I'm saying two things. This isn't a deep state in the classic sense, but that doesn't mean there's not a collective sense that this guy's trouble, and that there wasn't what is definitely, could technically be abuse of power in the sense of leaking things you're not supposed to leak. I think that's definitely could be the case. I'm maybe a little more ambivalent about it than you are. But anyway, what is your position on the deep state, the whole deep state thing, in kind of the way I've described
Yeah,
it.
yeah. I don't like the term deep state. I don't use it because to me it implies that there's this like shadowy force that we don't know about,
Right.
kind of like what you were describing in Turkey, which I don't think exists here. I think there's an entrenched bureaucracy with a lot of bureaucrats who have their own agendas, but I don't think that's like, and I think the real dangers are right in front of us, like, John Bolton, James Mattis, and the revolving door between.
Wait a second. Mattis is our hope at this point.
Yeah, right.
With Bolton and Pompeo, Mattis is the guy who says, "I hate Iran as much as you do, but I think nuking them would be premature." He's like,
Mattis served in Iraq and he oversaw just the massacres, effectively, of civilians. Killing wedding parties, and he defended it. So
well, what he would call collateral damage, in fairness, and what.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, he didn't intentionally bomb wedding parties, right?
He didn't intentionally bomb them, but he sees, the point is he's a part of the warfare state and did not, and has been a part of a really destructive killing machine that's killed a lot of innocent people. And so I certainly don't subscribe to the view that he's one of the adults in the room. That's also a term I've never.
I would say I think he's less casual in the use of force than either Bolton or probably Pompeo.
All right, sure. I mean,
because he's a thing people don't understand about military people. My father was actually an Army officer. I grew up in that milieu, and most of them don't like to go to war. I mean, if you tell them to go to war, they'll do it, and maybe with more enthusiasm than you would like, But generals, my father wasn't a general, but generals are, many of them are very careful to commit troops to war, and that's part of the reason that I think there's some hope that Mattis can be a kind of a stopgap. I'm not particularly a fan, but I think at this point he's one of our sources of actual hope. But anyway.
But let me say, though, as a quick side point, you see, I don't think actually war with Iran is quite the option that's on the table for them, because Iran can defend itself. And the U.S. usually doesn't attack countries that can defend itself. I mean, it attacked Iraq, I think, pretty explicitly for the reason that it knew that Iraq couldn't defend itself. I mean, otherwise, if it actually thought that Saddam had biological and chemical weapons, would it really have put all those troops in harm's way like that? I mean, I just, like, we invade places like Panama and Grenada, places that can't fight back. And so Iran can fight back. So I think when we talk about war on Iran, it's more ramping up military confrontation in areas where we can weaken Iran. So which means Lebanon, especially because Hezbollah, Iran's key allies there, and Hezbollah acts as a deterrent to Israel in terms of its ability to use force in that area. And so that's a place where I think the Trump people are going to look to target Iran. And also, in Syria, where they're now staying behind.
So more like Iranian proxies, as they would see them, is what you expect them to attack. Yeah.
And they're doing it in Syria, anyway. But
yeah,
so,
I think that is the first likely episode. There's already a little of that going on. Certainly from the Israeli side, not so much. America hasn't so much joined it, but I think that's a very likely scenario. I just think that it could lead more than people realize to actual engagement with Iran. Yeah.
If there's anyone who could do it, it would be John Bolton. I mean, described accurately as, I think, the craziest person to ever, or the most unstable person to ever serve in such a high position. Yeah. In many, many years, if not ever. So I totally so on the issue of the deep state and what drives the leaks. I mean, see, I'm all for the principle of intelligence people leaking material that they're concerned about. My problem, though, is that under Trump, we haven't seen too many leaks or any leaks really about civilian casualties in Yemen, or about the scale of support for the fundamentalist dictatorship in Saudi Arabia, or about support for the Israeli occupation of Palestinians. The leaks have been geared towards really one thing, which I think, at least from the beginning, was aimed at undermining Trump's stated intention to improve relations with Russia. So on the one hand, I'm all for leaks, but I don't have such a hopeful. I don't take such a hopeful view of the motive as I think others do. I think they've been designed to undermine the one area where I think Trump has been somewhat sensible in calling for greater cooperation with Russia, whatever his motive is there. I mean, maybe it's because he really wants to build Trump Moscow. I really don't know. But whatever his motive was, I actually think that the leaks have been designed to undermine the one thing where I think he's actually been somewhat sensible.
Now, it's an interesting point that the leaks, I'd have to look at them, but they have been pretty Russia-focused, and there's certainly a lot of fronts on which he'd be vulnerable. Now, it may be that some of the other fronts, like God knows, his company, the Trump organization, has committed who knows how many crimes. It may be that information is more like in the hands of the IRS, which is really pretty good about not leaking generally, I think. And so who knows? But it's a good point that it would be interesting to look at like the range of all possible leaks there could have been that would be damning to Trump. And I think there's a pretty broad range. And the ones there have actually been, and it may indeed be that those are disproportionately about Russia. That's a good point.
I mean, I think they're pretty much. There's been some leaks recently from the Mueller investigation about this character Nader, I think his name is, who has now his contacts with the UAE, and that's interesting. And like that's been going after Kushner. I mean, it's like if you look at a pattern, though, it's been
that I would say actually is the kind of leak. Again, I applaud you if you're against all leaks, but as leaks go, you would like that, right? Because that exposes a kind of nefarious form of influence that is favoring a policy of belligerence toward the whole kind of Iran axis as it's seen on the right, and so that's like anyway, that's a good point too.
Yeah.
So you don't use the term deep state, but you are suspicious of the pattern on balance of the leaks, and I've given you my PR guidance about.
Yes, and let me say one more thing about leaks. A lot of the leaks have come from Democrats. I mean, it's pretty obvious they're coming from Democrats in the House and Senate Intelligence committees, like the committees that are getting subpoenaed documents as part of the Russia probe. The Trump campaign turned over thousands of documents, so they've gotten those, and it's pretty obvious that that's who's also been leaking things about like for example, like an email from Trump aide Felix Sater talking about we're going to get you elected president if you build this Trump Tower in Moscow. Like when that came out, that was huge news, and that was seen as proof that like more proof of collusion, even though in the fine print the deal actually went nowhere, and like the Russian government never even came close to approving the financing that Trump asked for. But so if you look at the way the leaks are distributed and then reported, it's very obvious to me that they're coming from Democrats in Congress, and that to me is much more glaringly partisan than people in the so-called deep state.
Yeah. So who do you see as kind of your allies on who else do you see as kind of clustered around your part of the ideological landscape? And particularly, I guess I'd say people with some influence in the media. Maybe they have high-profile podcasts. Maybe you see them on cable news. Or do you feel there's very little in the media world representing your perspective?
Yeah, well, this is where it speaks to, in terms of the elements I was talking about before that converge to propel Russiagate, I think there's another one too, which is that people are understandably traumatized by Trump's victory and scared, totally understandably. And so given that Russiagate is, annoys Trump, it confronts him, there's talk of it leading to his impeachment, a lot of, people on the left have rallied behind it. So it's just become sort of reflexively, like Russiagate has become a good thing for many people on the left, because here it is, it's challenging Trump, and it also gives us a way to help explain his improbable victory, because we can just blame a foreign country for it instead of looking at ourselves. So it's like a convenient way to both oppose Trump and also grapple with his unfathomable victory, right? And so, but
it's also good for ratings, by the way. I mean, it's if you're doing a cable TV show,
it's great.
You're paying attention to what's working, and I myself, I'm totally intrigued by the Russia thing. It's just interesting,
I know. It's an interesting story, and I am too. And it also fits in with cable news loves to avoid talking about actual policy issues. They love things with characters and that can reduce it to individuals. Right. This is perfect for it. I mean, it's wonderful. And it's like between this and Stormy Daniels, it's just a constant soap opera. So it's great.
Those are the two parts of my brain right now.
Yeah.
Russiagate and Stormy Daniels. Together they occupy 98% of my my mental processing power these days. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, unfortunately for a lot of coastal liberals, that's what a lot of us are focused on right now, in part because our lives are just different and divorced from the realities that I think actually got Trump elected, which is people not in the but that's another conversation. And
but that is one of the costs of preoccupation.
Yeah.
With Russia or anything else. And I would also say with it's a cost of a highly reactive outrage to everything Trump does. I mean, I started this newsletter, the Mindful Resistance newsletter, available at mindfulresistance.net, precisely because of what I saw as a degree of outrage that was kind of counterproductive. And one thing all these things distract us from is actually examining why he got elected. I mean, he didn't win the popular vote, but he got a lot more votes than you'd like somebody like him to get, and there must be a reason. And there is some analysis of that, but I don't personally see as much as I'd like.
For example, just to give an example, my favorite cable news show is Chris Hayes' show.
Yeah. I mean, Chris he's really smart and really informed about policy, and I think likes to address serious policy within the constraints of having to do a cable TV show that gets enough people to watch it to stay on the air.
He's a cable news anchor in the 8 p.m. hour, so he's totally constrained by his time slot and his medium. But at the beginning of the year, after Trump won, he did these town halls with Bernie Sanders that were amazing. Like he went to Wisconsin, I think it was, and to West Virginia, and it was him and Bernie just talking to regular voters. Now, personally, I'm on the left, so I'm partial to Bernie, fine. But if he'd done this with any politician, just speaking to regular people and hearing from them why they voted for Trump or why they didn't vote for Hillary, why they stayed out of the race, it was amazing. And that was over a year ago. And since then, I mean, I watch Chris's show pretty regularly, but now it's pretty, like the majority of his stuff now is Russiagate. He's talking about constantly this plot to stop Mueller. It's very Mueller focused, and like everything is focused on this expectation that Mueller is going to get Trump. And I think, and this is where I think he, unfortunately, and other leftist liberal colleagues have really erred, is that we've bought into the Russiagate hype, not properly looked at the evidentiary basis for it, which is what I've been trying to do in my segments on The Real News, and also I write for The Nation magazine, and I try to go through the evidence carefully because I don't think there's enough there to indict Trump or to get him out of office. And meanwhile, I think what's going on is Russiagate is being used by some pretty unsavory forces in this country to stigmatize dissent, to taint opposition.
What are examples of that?
Well, like look at Bernie Sanders and how much he's had to answer for this like purported Russian support for his campaign. Like the fact that there were some Facebook ads that backed Bernie, like meant Bernie had to like disavow Russia, and Bernie had to come out and say, I thought I was running against Hillary Clinton in the primary. I didn't realize that Hillary was also running against Russia. And he's and Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate. Like, now, listen, personally, I have my own opinions about Jill Stein. I think I'm not of the mind that there's no difference between Trump and Clinton or between Gore and Bush, like going back to the Ralph Nader debate of 2000. So, if I were Jill Stein, I would have said to my supporters in swing states, vote for Clinton because it's better to have her in office than Trump. But anyway, I don't agree, though, with tainting her as a Russian agent because she happened to go to an RT gala a few years ago, which she paid her way for. And now she's being investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee for collusion with the Russian government because she went to that gala. And all this serves to stigmatize people who are on the left who challenge power because there's some tangential connection to Russia. It's being used against them. And I don't see those of us on the left. I'm talking especially about, I used to work at Democracy Now!, which is, I was there for 10 years. Mm-hmm. It's was long been my favorite news show, and I was a big part of it. And they've, except for having Glenn on occasionally, they've really bought into this Russiagate stuff. Not because I think they share any kind of Cold War agenda and they want to target leftists, but they've bought into it because and it's just my opinion, because it's a convenient and easy way to oppose Trump. But I think it misses the mark because we're not looking at who it serves and what actually its consequences are.
Yeah. Let me just say a couple of things. I remember my first kind of aversive reaction to the extent of the emphasis on the Russia thing was related to one thing you just said, which is just the idea of stigmatizing people because of alleged connections to nefarious foreign influence has a really unsavory history in America. That's what McCarthyism was. And so whenever and there's also the inherently an element of xenophobia, like who are these mysterious aliens who are, and so I always just react against that. And I remember that being my first grounds for being skeptical of like how far the emphasis on Russia seemed to be going. The other thing I'd say is, you mentioned that Chris Hayes does a lot of stuff on the possibility that Trump will try to end the Mueller investigation. That is a concern of mine. And, because whatever you think about how much there is there in it for Mueller to find in Russia, God knows there is plenty of wrongdoing and illegality of one form or another that Mueller has already uncovered. I mean, Trump is he's an amoral and careless person who has surrounded himself with amoral and careless people and bad lawyers, not even good lawyers. There's just no doubt that there's some kinds of illegality in this guy's history. I'm perfectly happy for them to, God knows it's as legitimate as Bill Clinton getting nailed on a perjury rap because they snuck in this totally irrelevant question. Yeah. To in his his whatever. And so also I just don't like the precedent of a president managing to derail a legally authorized investigation of him. This is a concern of mine, and I'm actually worried that we haven't thought through exactly what ways he might do this and what forms of popular protest there would be. So I'm like all for that as a mild obsession. But anyway. But
let me say, I think we need to be two things here. I think we need to be consistent here. So if it was unfair, and I think it was, for however the Clinton investigation started out, it started out as an investigation into Whitewater, right? That's how it started. And then it veered into this whole thing about Lewinsky and perjury, and that was ridiculous. I mean, it was used as a right-wing witch hunt against Clinton, by their opponents who really hated the Clintons so much, and used that to expand this into this dumb thing that wasted everyone's time back in, and had all sorts of bad consequences. I'm not sure. I mean, I can't prove this, but I don't know if Clinton would have made some decisions that he made, like bombing Sudan and destroying a pharmaceutical plant there that destroyed the country's capacity to make medicine. I'm not sure he would have done that if not for Lewinsky. I can't prove that. Anyway, but if we oppose that then we should oppose that here too. And to the extent that the Mueller thing has gone off the rails, it's now the sprawling investigation. They're going after everything. I thought it was just about Russia, but now they're going to, I think we have to be consistent because otherwise we're establishing a predicate that could be used against.
That's a good point, and I should probably be more consistent in that regard. I would still say it's just a super bad precedent for a president to be able to derail a legally authorized investigation. We should fight that. We should fight that tooth and nail. Plus, I think there is a non-trivial chance that on the specific matter the investigation was authorized to investigate, the Russia thing, I think there's a chance that there's something illegal. I think there's a real chance. I don't think. I mean, I don't buy this whole Manchurian candidate stuff, which has gotten totally out of control. I mean, just one little thing. Rachel Maddow the other day, I saw this tweet where she had said on her show, Mike Pompeo and McMaster, right before they were fired, had said something negative about Russia. Well, both guys were replaced by people who were more anti-Russia than they were. This is crazy. Yeah. So I totally take how out of hand it's gotten, but I do think, anyway, that's just my view. Is like if he tries to stop the Mueller investigation, I'm gonna mobilize.
Okay, so let me talk about that. But let me say first of all, just as a side note about Maddow, when Tillerson was hired as
right, he
Secretary,
was the Russian stooge.
Maddow was
and now
really
the Russians want him fired.
Yeah, so like Maddow really strongly suggested that the Tillerson was hired because Putin recommended him. Same thing with Manafort. But anyway, so the thing is, this whole threat to the Mueller investigation, I know it's talked about a lot. I don't actually see it. I don't actually see where the investigation is under threat. I mean, like, the rumors really kicked into high gear, according to the timeline I have that I remember, is like when Jackie Speer, the Democratic Congress member from California, said in like December that she heard a rumor on the Hill that Trump was going to fire Mueller before Christmas. And then we saw this huge, like, it really kicked into high gear after that. Liberal groups came out with petitions, people pledging to mobilize in the streets. And meanwhile, this was happening at the same time as a Republican tax heist. One of the largest, if not the largest, upward transfers of wealth in U.S. history. And where was the mobilization for that? I mean, at that time, there was as much, if not more, discussion of this potential that Trump was going to fire Mueller before Christmas and then before New Year's. But meanwhile, it didn't happen. And I actually see, I mean, it's taken as fact that Trump is trying to block Mueller. You know, as I said, Chris Hayes has this recurring segment called The Plot to Stop Mueller. But I see it like as, to be honest with you, more of like a liberal freak out, like a liberal like anxiety disorder than an actual something that's based on.
Well, he did fire Comey seemingly because Comey was getting too nosy, and he's made these noises about, he's put out things that could be construed as trial balloons.
He says things on Twitter. Yeah, I guess they've listen. If you look at the investigation, what have they come up with so far? Nothing really to do with the campaign.
We don't know what they've come up with.
Well, but in terms of the indictments, we do know that they've indicted Flynn, they've indicted Manafort. They've indicted Manafort for nothing to do with the campaign. It's all money laundering in Ukraine, having to do with his work in Ukraine much before the campaign. I mean, listen, so it's true, and maybe they'll come out with more.
Yeah.
But I don't see, like, my concern also is how people in the middle of the country, people who once voted for Obama, and who then turned to Trump because they thought Trump was going to be their guy. I see them looking at liberals freaking out about this investigation and hyper-focusing on it, not addressing their actual concerns. And I'm just worried about that. I don't see how we're going to get enough people to vote against Trump in 2020 or even in 2018 when our top concern is the status of an investigation and the characters involved, especially when, I don't know. I don't take it as truth, and I guess I'm repeating myself. I don't take it as truth that Trump wants to stop Mueller. Yes, he fired Comey, and I don't but the investigation was already he did allow for this investigation. I mean, like there wouldn't have been a Russia investigation.
We didn't have much choice. The way it unfolded.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, listen. I guess I'm going off my hunch here, but you're right. I mean, certainly the investigation should proceed. I'm not calling for shutting it down. It's just not my top concern. I guess that's, yeah.
Quick question on this ideological consistency front that just occurred to me. Like, I do feel you're out ideological. You're out consistentizing me or something when you like just oppose like all leaks from the intelligence agency, and I admit that sometimes I see.
I'm not opposed to all leaks. I'm not opposed to. I just want to. We should question their motives. That's all.
Okay. So that there's another issue though where consistency emerges, and that is on the kind of Antifa question. And I have sensed, maybe wrongly, but from your part of the ideological landscape, I don't want to say sympathy for Antifa because I think Antifa does some good things. Sometimes they just defend people physically who are under threat, which is good. But of course, Antifa does seem to, in some cases, have initiated violence, as I understand it, to stop what I would call constitutionally protected free speech. If that has happened, and I think they have not come out against that. I mean, I don't think they've said that no, we don't do that. If that has happened, I'm 100% against it. And there I feel I am being consistent just across the board. You should not use violence or physical intimidation to suppress constitutionally protected speech. period, even though I grant you Trump is in a certain sense an emergency. You know, he's a really problematic guy. But I'm wondering how you feel about that and whether you think I'm right that kind of in what we could call your part of the left, there actually is a certain amount of support or tolerance of these kinds of aggressive tactics by Antifa.
Yeah. Look, this is where I can only speak for myself because many friends of mine on the left totally support Antifa and shutting down speeches from right-wingers, from white supremacists on campus. My default position is actually is yours. I actually don't agree with interfering the right to free speech. But I will say that the problem for me is it's not when I speak to like a white Antifa member. It's when I speak to an African American or a person of color who feels that if like a white supremacist is speaking on campus, then it's not just, I mean, yes, they're speaking, but what they're also doing is actively recruiting for a project, for an enterprise that engenders violence towards people of color. Mm-hmm. And that's when it gets tricky for me, because if it's true that me as like a white Jew I'm not threatened so much by racist white supremacists. I mean, their main target is people of color. So is it privileged and is it out of touch for me to say to cling to this thing about free speech and not hear their concerns? They're concerned about someone saying stuff that actively recruits for efforts
that winds up inciting violence against them.
Yeah. I mean, so I don't know the answer there, but my default position, no, is I don't. I mean, Chomsky says that, violence best serves those who have a monopoly on violence. And that is the state and its right-wingers like with guns. And so there's no so tactically, it's just a bad idea to get into the violence game.
That is part of my concern.
So I mean, that's the principle I take. But when it gets down to actual practical cases of Richard Spencer speaking on campus, or I mean, certainly in Charlottesville when Antifa defended people from white supremacists, I thought that was very admirable. Obviously,
Yeah, when it was strictly defense, I'm all for it.
Yeah. But the stuff is messy, and I have my default position, but I also, when a person of color especially tells me that, I mean, how can I just dismiss that based on my abstract commitment to free speech?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Okay, so we've almost run out of time, but just quickly, let's talk a little bit about 2020, the presidential campaign. Would I be correct in guessing you're a Bernie guy?
Bernie's certainly my preference. Yeah.
Are there any other? Is there somebody in second place?
I mean, domestically, I like a lot of what Elizabeth Warren stands for, but she's saying she's not running. So otherwise, I don't know enough about the other candidates to really weigh in. I mean, I have some friends who love Kamala Harris, others who think that she's just another neoliberal Democrat who takes certain positions to mollify the progressive base. But, I don't know enough there. But I mean, I did actually want to put one thing to you, which is I thought about before in terms of my place on the spectrum. And, so certainly on Russiagate, I've been very vocal, I think, in my skepticism and in questioning the agenda. And, it's made me some enemies, even on the liberal left, dinner parties that I used to get invited to, I don't anymore.
That's a problem for a lot of us.
Yeah. But, I was thinking about it. I was fighting the other day on Twitter with someone, and I was questioning their perspective, and I was accusing, it was another reporter. I was basically accusing them of overlooking key facts in the service of advancing a Russiagate narrative to make liberals feel better. And, part of my motivation is that, I have to look myself in the mirror and I have to say to myself, am I being honest in my work, and am I approaching issues honestly, or am I serving a political agenda that might benefit me? So certainly it's advantageous as a liberal journalist to push Russiagate. You'll get plenty of bylines, and it's a growth industry right now. But the person I was fighting with, he has children, right? So when he looks in the mirror, he has to look at himself, not just am I, being the most woke and keeping it the most real in my politics, but also am I feeding my kids? And, I don't have kids. And so I was thinking it's easier for me actually to take this position and to be sort of adversarial and confrontational because I'm not depriving anyone of sustenance, of a livelihood, except for myself if I do that, And also the fact is I'm paid right now to be skeptical, so I was thinking about just how this political moment, it puts all of us in different positions. And I guess, as polarizing as Russiagate has been, I understand why. I mean, why it's harder for people to go against it because it is just like it's the way the wind is blowing right now. And we all have different considerations that we have to take into account when we look ourselves in the mirror.
Yeah, it's so you don't begrudge Russia obsessives their unhealthy obsession. That's good. But no, you wouldn't put it quite like that. I know, but it's a real thing. I mean, I remember right before we just had the 15th anniversary of the Iraq invasion. I remember right before the Iraq War. I was against it. I came out against it. I wrote against it. It was like a kind of uncomfortable place to be. I mean, it was, and you probably don't even remember it. I mean, I'm not as a I don't know how old you are, but you don't remember it as a working journalist, presumably. But it was like, well, I'll tell you more than that. What was interesting was right after 9/11, you almost could not criticize the president. That may sound crazy, but see, I had never seen a country with a true war psychology because I lived through Vietnam, but that was an unpopular war. There was never any sense of threat to America. After 9/11, the degree of rallying around the flag was really instructive for me. And that was just, you got a sense of how hard it can be to swim against the current. The run-up to the Iraq War was another case. And, I think social media has in a way exacerbated all this because the blowback you get feels so intense. Mm-hmm. It's like micro blowback. It's like, moment by moment. But so I take your point. No, I mean, the older I've gotten, the more seriously I've taken the idea that there really is an establishment. I mean, that was a term back in Vietnam. You were the establishment was this nefarious thing. There really is one. It's not that easy to defy its dictates, and with it not influencing your career at all.
My friend Max Blumenthal, who you've had on, who I work with closely, one of my favorite journalists. I really follow his work closely. I mean, he's also a friend of mine, so it's easy to do. But he says that to him, this is the most, in terms of a toxic political climate, to me, it's actually, to him, he says, it's the worst since 9/11. Even worse than kind of the Iraq War, because at least during the Iraq War, liberals were many liberals at least, were at the forefront of challenging the government narrative, challenging the WMD claim. Now, Max says, and I agree with him, that liberals have been co-opted to push a Cold War narrative. And those who question it are being pushed even more to the fringes than those who criticize the Iraq War were. So it's just speaking of 9/11, that's part of the reason to me why Russiagate is so dangerous is because the villain is Trump on the surface. It's meant that people on the liberal left have joined in what I think is a very dangerous chorus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's. I guess the two are related. I mean, it's because Trump is perceived as such a danger, and I think to some extent rightly. I mean, I'm totally freaked out, but that is what creates so much pressure for conformity on the left, I think. Mm-hmm. It's almost like the way 9/11 did in a sense, because it is perceived as a threat to the country. And I don't think that's like a crazy perception. I'm very alarmed by Trump. I'm not alarmed in exactly the way some other people are. I don't have what I think is an overly simple view of like how the people who elected him to office. I don't think they are as uniformly alarming as some people think, like they're all racist or all fascist or anything. I don't buy that, but I'm alarmed, so I get it, but I take your point that there's a lot of pressure for conformity. So, how is it going? So the real news is this thing that stands in, I guess, defiance of the media establishment. It's actually in Baltimore, right? I don't know if you're there. Are you in Baltimore?
I'm in Brooklyn right now, but
Okay.
yeah, it's based in Baltimore, and it's the focus, a big focus there is on local Baltimore issues, of which there are many, and the idea is to, provide a media platform that's the voice of the people, and looking at local issues while also looking at international ones as well. I don't really do the Baltimore stuff, but there's a whole Baltimore bureau that covers education policy, crime, policing, really in depth, and they're a great team. And and the idea is to sort of try to reclaim sort of like that local community journalism that has been decimated across the country with the closing of all these weeklies, and just in general, just money not being put into having reporters on the beat. I mean, this is something that David Simon of The Wire talks about a lot. Just not having journalists serving the community anymore, sort of feeding into this like more national corporate structure where they just take, like their a lot of it is wire copy and avoiding actually local issues. Mm-hmm. So, and the real news is, so we cover Baltimore stuff, and then also I try to do the more global stuff. So I do a lot of Russiagate, but also, whatever else is going on.
And are you finding that it's resonating? You're building an audience?
Well, it's. I think so. I mean, but it's tough to reach people. We all have a lot of choices, and also because we don't have as much money, we're not putting out as high a production quality.
No, and it's getting so competitive because all of these major platforms are starting all these podcasts, and there's only so much time in the world.
Sure.
I mean, you're increasingly competing against these behemoths.
And our attention spans, all of us are a lot. To the extent we can speak we can make a sweeping statement. Our attention spans have gone down, I think, overall, and our expectations for how we consume things. We don't want to hear someone talk for too long. We want sound bites and visuals and graphics. So it's like which has its advantages, but also its disadvantages. I just have one thought, Bob, in terms of what you're saying there about people's fear of Trump right now, which is I obviously share. I wonder if there's a Buddhist teaching here. It's something that drawing from your book, Why Buddhism is True, and that our emotions are there, but they're not always obviously based on the present moment.
Well, it's funny. I have an affiliation with Union Theological Seminary, which is this like traditionally left-wing Christian thing, but increasingly it's kind of globally ecumenical. They have a Buddhist program and Islamic stuff and so on. But just the other day, I was talking to President Serene Jones in a public setting, and she was talking about some gathering she had gone to that I had actually not been at, but it was a gathering at Union of like Buddhist activists. And then there were also the Union like Christian students and or various things other than Buddhist, I guess. And I mean they are pretty their left-wing credentials are not in doubt. And she said the one point of tension was the Buddhists were insisting that when you look at whoever you think of as your enemy, Trump, so on, whoever, you just shouldn't think of them as evil. You shouldn't think of them as like an enemy. It's like they're almost a victim like you are, and it's just they are a problem. You should skillfully address whatever threat they pose. It's like, yes, we should get Trump out of office, but the Buddhists, she said, counseled very much against getting like emotionally wrapped up in the vilification. And that's what I would say is a Buddhist theme I would totally get behind, because I think, leave aside Buddhism, just what I've learned from psychology, including evolutionary psychology, is that the more you think of someone as an enemy, the more that warps your perception of their motivations and everything else. And that's why, like, when there's a run-up to a war, the people who want to go to war spend a lot of resources demonizing the leader of the other country. It's like New Republic, this was the first, the Persian Gulf War, put Saddam Hussein on the cover with a Hitler mustache, right? Because once you're thinking of the person as like a totally vile enemy, that affects the way you process the information. You're not going to accept the idea that maybe they didn't even bother with a weapons of mass destruction program. That's not consistent with the narrative. So I would just say, it's not that I would even go so far as to say love your enemy, which Jesus actually said. If that would be a totally Christian take home to not vilify your enemy, but for whatever reason, it's not always. No religion is always consistent with its with the values you can find in its text. But in any event, I would say I'm not urging compassion for Trump, love of Trump, or of Trump supporters. I'm just saying, the more calmly you view them, and the less you do what Hillary did in kind of essentializing Trump voters as, well, or some substantial fraction of them as deplorables or whatever, just the more clearly you're going to see the situation, and the more skillfully you're going to be able to deal with it. I think that's an underappreciated take home of a basically Buddhist approach to it. You don't have to get mushy and love them. Some Buddhists would counsel that, some Christians would counsel it, but just view them objectively and clearly.
I try to guide myself by, is there something that I identify in them that I don't like about myself? And if that's true, then is that impacting my emotional experience with them? And is it impacting just how contemptuous I am of them? Because, a lot of people I argue with, I have contempt, I find myself having contempt for. But I often find that if I take the emotion out of it, and if I first identify what the emotion is, it's often there's a certain dishonesty that I don't like. But it's fine to have an opinion of someone who's being dishonest or immoral, but the emotion attached to it often, in my experience, can be associated with something actually in myself that I don't like. And that's what drives the charge. So I try to do that as much as possible too. If I'm coming from a place of, if I have a bitter feeling towards someone when I'm arguing with them, am I actually reacting from a place where I'm targeting them because of something? I'm targeting them with the emotion, with the force of an emotion that comes from actually some discomfort with something in myself. And when I can move,
so the loathing is really self-loathing.
Yeah. I mean, now they can only go so far. I think some people deserve contempt, deserve to be vilified. I'm not sure if. I think it's healthy to vilify people in power, especially because they're in such by their nature of being in the position they're in a confrontational position that's part of I think, right. That's adverse to normal average people.
Yeah, no, but, Trump is technically the enemy. I want him to be thwarted, but it's just that if you get wrapped up in the psychology that accompanies viewing someone as an enemy, it can make it harder to thwart them. Yes. I mean, Trump viewed in a certain way is just so pathetic, right? I mean, Trump is just like all of the bad things about a human being turned up to 11, and that's why you can see parts of yourself in Trump, because all of the things, the narcissism, the dishonesty, all of it is in, I think, all of us in a smaller measure.
Yeah. That Harvey Weinstein tape that came out where he's trying to coerce that woman to go into his hotel room. Yeah. I mean, that was my reaction. It was pathetic. And
totally.
I mean, so it's, how do you react to that? Because obviously he's been accused of criminal acts and he deserves to be punished for them. But I just felt a certain, not compassion for him, but it's like there is an emotional thing there. There's a psychological thing that to me it's like beyond just evil. There was just like, it was like there was something just really sad about it. Sad about psychology.
Harvey Weinstein started out, I'm sure, as a guy who wasn't getting any respect on the junior high playground. And those are actual reports. Like he was awkward and blah blah blah. And it's like the more you understand about people, the harder it is to hate them. But that is also the flip side of that, is that when you try to get analytical about anything in policy, I wrote this piece for The Intercept recently. It's like, could we just look at the situation the way Iran may look at it so we can better understand their motivations? Are the troops really there because they want to attack Israel, or is it just a deterrent? It's important to be clear on these things. Let's at least examine the possible perspectives they may have. And you get the predictable blowback. People think you are justifying their behavior, excusing their behavior, because you're trying to understand it. And this is, I think this is just about the biggest threat to, humankind in a certain sense, is just the resistance people have the intuitive visceral resistance, which itself is part of human nature, to seeing people who do bad things examined clearly, because we are inclined to think that to explain is to exonerate. And you have to be able to separate those two and say, no, we are going to punish people who did bad things. We just want to understand why they do them.
Right. And in the case of Iran, there's also the fact is, are we accounting for sufficiently our own presumptions about what Iran is and who we are? So, for example, we take for granted the right that we have the right to go around and bomb whoever we want. We don't afford Iran that same right. We don't even really afford Iran the right to defend itself from serious threats to itself. Hey, that's a whole other story.
Yeah, it is, but it reminds me, if I ever have time, I'm going to write a piece in defense of whataboutism. I mean, whataboutism has become this like label, right? Like whenever you say, like, just raise a question, okay, but to what extent do we interfere in other countries' election? I'm just asking. People are like, oh, that's whataboutism. You're trying to excuse. I just think whataboutism has a lot of virtues, and it's just a healthy exercise.
People who are uncomfortable with whataboutism or like whatever that means, I think are uncomfortable with having their own presumption of American supremacy and exceptionalism challenged. Because that's ultimately that's what underpins whataboutism. It's saying, well, what about what we do to other people?
Right.
But if you presume that we have the right to do whatever we want and that we're somehow like the chosen people as a country, then any type of inquiry like that is going to be an affront to that. And by the way, that's what I think Russiagate is partly about. It's about protecting the sense of like entitled American privilege that we can do whatever we want. But if someone does anything to us, that's like it's a crime against humanity.
No, I think, I agree. And the charge you don't hear this the other charge you get accused of aside from whataboutism is moral equivalence. I mean, as soon as you just start asking the question, like, what kinds of things have we done that are comparable to the things we're condemning? Moral equivalence. And it's a challenge. There are a lot. I'm getting depressed. We should stop.
That's what happens when you talk about politics.
I know. It's not hopeless, though. After all, there is the real news.
There is the real news. That's true.
So the headquarters of the counter-establishment has been established in Baltimore, a stone's throw from Washington, close enough for an actual attack.
Exactly.
Once you have amassed the troops.
Exactly.
Just Amtrak, or a short Amtrak right away for the troops. So there's hope.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so where can people find you on Twitter?
My handle is Aaron J Maté, AARONJMATE.
And is there anything special they need to know to find you on the Real News, or is it just pretty much a straightforward Google?
I'm actually working, therealnews.com. I'm not there as much currently because I'm actually working on a book about Russiagate.
Okay.
So that's taking up a lot of my time. And I also write for The Nation magazine every couple weeks. So you can catch me there too.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Aaron. This has been a lot of fun, and good luck with the revolution.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it.
Bye.
All right. Bye.